Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear viewers, let me welcome you to another episode of Sirat al-Mustaqim, the Straight Path. In this episode, I would like to focus on my family, my upbringing. I was, as I said once before, born in 1938, the youngest by 1 hour. I have a twin brother of 8 children. My father died when I was about 8 years old. I have 4 brothers and 3 sisters, and the eldest brother and I began to form a relationship where we used to go to athletics meetings and other items of interest, just the 2 of us, and all of us used to do fishing, the boys. So we had quite a lot of interaction in terms of being together. Of course, the eldest brother was 10 years older than me, and the next one was about 4 years younger than him, and another brother died in 1955. He was killed in a road smash in Germany, just older than my twin and myself, so he was about 3 years older than me. My sisters were, the eldest sister was about 2 years older than the eldest brother. Second eldest sister was about 3 years younger, and the youngest sister was about 6 years younger than the eldest brother. So that puts them at least 5 to 6 years older than me, after the brother that was 3 years older. That's the family background. We were not rich by any means. We were quite poor, really, relatively speaking, and we struggled for an upbringing. I actually passed the 11+ exam in those days, which meant that one could go to the grammar school, but my mother couldn't afford to send me, and she didn't want to give me an uneven advantage over my twin brother, because he didn't pass, so I didn't go to the grammar school. But then we went to a technical school when we were 13, and the technical school taught us the basic crafts, trades, engineering, woodworking, this sort of thing. And it was a question of what to do when I left school, and we didn't really know. I wanted to work in a garage. I thought in terms of owning a garage of my own at some stage, but when it came to signing indentures, I gave that up, and I went to look for something else, and eventually I drifted into research, and I took physics, and I studied physics part-time, ONC, and then I got called up for national service. In the meantime, my twin brother was studying engineering, and he'd got his ONC and was doing his HNC, and then he got his membership of the Mechanical Engineering Institute. I did 2 years national service and came back and wanted to continue studying. I did HNC in Higher National Certificate in physics, but I didn't get over 60%, and the problem with that was that I had to do part 1 of the Institute of Physics, and I didn't actually pass that. I passed 2 papers 1 year and failed 2, and the next year I passed the 2 I failed, and failed the 2 I passed. But ultimately I was exempt part 1 of the Institute of Physics exams, but it didn't really help. I got an ulcer and I gave up studying then. The sisters, one was working as a chef or a cook for the directors in a particular company, and the other one, she was a sales assistant in a shop. And the 2 brothers went into mental health, and the twin brother, I said, he was an engineer. Started off as a draftsman and worked himself up as project manager, project engineer, and then a full-blown engineer. And he was involved in the paper trade, so he was on site when they were building paper mills in some countries. So that's the basis of the family. My mother, obviously she had to struggle to bring us all up, and my father died of cancer, so she was taking him around the hospitals in London, and they didn't know so much about cancer around about 1947, 1948, and that's when he died. The memories I have of him as being on his back for the last 6 months and just being able to take bread dipped in milk, and that we used to sit with him for an hour or two in the evenings and talk to him when we came back from school, or read to him, and that's the memories that I have. He was a gardener by profession, and that's basically all I remember about him, unfortunately. But the values that I spoke of in terms of my personal code, obviously these were ingrained in me from the family, and this is where the relationships were important, because the eldest brother, he had principles. He wouldn't take anything on interest. If he couldn't purchase it outright, he wouldn't have it. So that was something that I learnt from him. And another thing was that we were always encouraged to tell the truth, and I found that be beneficial in life. And it was, in one sense, it's so easy to tell the truth. When you listen to people who are lying, it just goes on and on and on, and then eventually it's like a house of cards. It just collapses because they can't sustain it. So you can see through some people, and that's how you begin to, if you like, evaluate relationships with other people. The relationship when I became Muslim wasn't strained really, because I was already living away from home, and I used to go back, and my mother had no problems cooking food if I brought the meat, for instance, or whatever it was that I did, and she would cook more or less what was required. And even at the age of 80, she would actually make soda bread so that we could have bread. Otherwise we couldn't have bread. So this was something that was quite convenient and quite good, and I liked that. But eventually, of course, the bread improved and we could eat the bread, and then the pita bread came along and things like this, so there were alternatives, but initially there weren't too many alternatives, and it was a bit of a struggle. But even my family members would say, if you want us to get halal meat, we will get it for you. You just tell us where the meat shop is. And one of my sisters was willing to travel 7 miles just to get halal meat so that she could cook it for me when I came home. We lived about 30 miles south of London, which was a place called Caterham on the outskirts of Croydon, which Croydon is now almost integral with London. It's become quite big. And Caterham was in 2 parts, as the hill and the valley, but it was a village really, right almost on the outskirts of the Green Belt area and the North Downs. And so we had the countryside around us, and we could get up to London very easily, or even into Croydon. So this was the sort of background. And I actually went to school in Red Hill, which is another town, now not a big town, but reasonable size, about 7 miles from Caterham. So that's the sort of background that I had. I was quite active in sports. I did running for quite a while, and then I gave that up, and I did cycling until I went into the army, and I tried a bit of cycle racing, but I wasn't any good at it, but I used to like riding the bike. And on a Sunday, for instance, would quite happily ride about 100 miles out and back, either to Brighton and back, or Hastings and back, or down to the coast and back, or even to Oxford and back, and eventually up to Cambridge and back, sort of thing. So, just sort of ride around the countryside on a bike, and it was quite pleasant, and it was a way of seeing the country, and it was a way of getting a lot of exercise. And that's what I used to do, and that was the main things. I did play sport as well, but in terms of table tennis and chess. But anyway, that's come to the end of this part. So we'll take a short break and come back with you in a short while, inshallah. So keep watching. Welcome back, dear viewers, to the next part of Sirat al-Mustaqim. It's the straight path, and trying to focus on my upbringing, my work and social interaction in the family, etc. Okay? So I was working initially in a research lab for physics research on paper, okay, and I was there for about 3 years, and gradually I got a little bit disillusioned and I went to work in the electronics lab. But then the National Service Deferment Board said, you're not training to be a physicist now, you're an electronic engineer and we want you in the army. So I had to do national service, and I got called up and I did my basic training in Catterick in Yorkshire on the moors for 1 month, and then from there I went, still in Catterick, but I went to trade training in the Royal Signals as an electronic technician. And then after 7 months training, I was posted to Malta, where I worked on cipher equipment and communications. I did a 3-month spell in Libya, Tripoli, and then went back to Malta. And eventually I got an early discharge on the grounds of I wanted to continue studying, and the course started before I would normally have been demobbed, but national service was coming to an end, which was forced conscription in the army, if you like, or the armed services, and they allowed me to leave 3 months early so I could take up the studies, and I then continued with HNC. Then I went back to the firm that I'd been employed by before I went into the army, and they said, we haven't got a job for you, whereas by law they were supposed to take me back. So when that was pointed out to them, oh, of course we got a job for you, but by then it was too late. I'd seen the writing on the wall and I was looking for another job. So I got one, but that was in London. I didn't like working in London, so I left that after a year, and I went to work in an electronics lab in almost near Gatwick Airport, on the borders of Surrey and Sussex. And I stayed there for over 3 years. But then when I didn't get graduateship at the Institute of Physics, because I had an ulcer and I couldn't keep studying and I didn't pass the exams anyway, I decided to try industry. So I went into industry and I went up to Glasgow and I worked in industry for 3 years, and then I found the problems were cyclical. They were just coming round and round and round all the time, the same problems, and so I decided that industry wasn't for me, but I found I could make a decision. So now I was at the stage where I could actually handle people. I used to have about 60 people working for me in the factory, and I found I could make a decision. So now I went back into research again, physics research. And then there was no funding for physics research, and they bought big computers and they wanted people to cross-transfer within the research establishment. So that's when I moved to computers, and that's when I moved into the hostel, and that's when I began to find out about Islam. And now the core values were actually coming to the fore, because as I spoke to the Imam in Oxford and found out more about Islam, I found that it was logical, it was consistent, it had direction, and it had purpose. And in fact, when someone asked me once, what was the difference between your life as a Muslim and your life before you became Muslim, I said, when I became Muslim, my life had direction and purpose, whereas beforehand it only had purpose but no direction. And so it was like a scalar quantity compared to a vector quantity, if we like to think in those terms, where it has magnitude and direction as opposed to only magnitude, no direction. So alhamdulillah, I found that there was nothing inconsistent with my view of life and Islam. I did have to modify a few things, as I mentioned, dietary habits and discipline of prayer, fasting and so on. But all of these things were not a real imposition, and in fact they were a pleasure and one liked to do them. So it took me a while to learn Arabic to be able to pray. As I said, I had to go 12 miles to go to a mosque or to find a Muslim, and there was a dearth of material available. It's not like now you can get everything from the internet or even from your phone or whatever it is, your iPad. But in those days there was none of this available, and the books themselves weren't that good in general terms. The English left something to be desired, and the printing quality wasn't very good in most cases. And then there was a dearth of real material anyway, so it was not easy. And then to find people who were knowledgeable was even more difficult, okay? I was lucky that the person I did find was knowledgeable, that he was similar background to myself. He'd come from London, and we got on very well, alhamdulillah. And he's still alive. He's 86 now, and I went to see him just last year, as a matter of fact, because he was my mentor, and I kept in touch with him all the time, alhamdulillah. The issues that were raised in Christianity, which Christianity didn't seem to address in society, Islam does address. Okay, if we look at things like binge drinking at the moment, Islam has an answer for that. Don't drink. Okay, it's that simple. And so it goes on. But I'm not going to emphasize those points because that's getting into issues which are not personal. This is actually the religion itself. The personal reaction with the religion was that I found it fairly easy to pray after I learnt to pray, and it took me about 6 months to learn to pray in Arabic. But alhamdulillah, kept it up and actually began to want to do it and look forward to doing it. So I was encouraged in this by people I met, and although I had to go 12 miles to find a Muslim, it doesn't mean that I found myself an outsider completely. I didn't, okay? Of course, if you change your religion, you're not going to be in step with the people that you had friends with. And so your friends are going to change gradually with time. And that's what I found. Some of the things that I was doing, I stopped doing. One of the things we used to do was to go to the pub for a drink, for instance. But I gradually stopped doing that and changed that circle of friends. I still played squash. I didn't have a problem with that because we were playing matches. And even the meal afterwards, I could go without that and come back home. So there's no issues here. The real issues were, what is the value that you put on your life? Are you prepared to work just for yourself, or are you prepared to do something for other people if you can? Are you a caring and sharing person, or are you a selfish person? These are the sort of issues that one faces, and these were the issues that I faced. But I'd already made the decision on most of these when I adopted the code that I did, that I would try to help others if I could, okay? And so in going through life like that, one was sort of cognizant of other people. You looked at other people, you looked at other people's values. Of course, you looked at your own as well, and you reviewed your own from time to time. But essentially, the issue was, are you living for yourself, or are you living for others? And in Islam, the issue is, of course, that you are living for Allah, and everything you do is directed towards Him as an act of worship. And so this became paramount in my life, and gradually this set the direction for my life, okay? I can't say it happened overnight, because I was always concerned as to whether there would come a time in my life when I would find something out about Islam that I couldn't cope with, that I couldn't understand, or I just couldn't do. I didn't know enough about the religion to know whether there was something like that coming my way or not. And so I did have a concern as to whether I would always be a Muslim, or whether at some stage, having gone away from Christianity, I would want to go away from Islam as well. Since I didn't know, I couldn't form an opinion. And that was something that worried me, and we'll talk about that more in another episode, inshallah. But it was something I was living with at the time, and it was something that was on a back burner. But in the meantime, I was still struggling to understand the religion and to practice it as best I could. And I was finding 1 or 2 books on Islam, and I was reading a little bit about it. I was attending the Quran al-Kareem on a Thursday evening, which the Imam was doing, and there were only about 5 of us going at the most, and we were in the middle of a warehouse, or an ex-warehouse that had been turned into a mosque, and there was no heating in that, so in the middle of winter, we used to be in the middle of this warehouse, freezing cold. Almost shivering, and after an hour or so we used to call it a day and come home. But at least we were trying, alhamdulillah. But I mean, that's how difficult it was to start with. It's got a lot easier since then, alhamdulillah. And as we'll see, the mosques now are purpose built, some of them, and they've got the facilities that you needed. But in those days it was converted warehouses or house mosques. So we've come to the end of this episode, and inshallah we'll meet again in another episode. And until then, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.